The global oil era is ending, and a new resource war has begun. While the world watches China and the West, something far bigger is happening between India and Africa, and it is starting in Burkina Faso.
The age of oil ended without ceremony. There were no grand announcements, no flags lowered, no speeches carved into stone. It ended the way most empires do, quietly, when the world woke up one morning and realized it no longer needed what had once controlled it. Pipes rusted in deserts. Refineries grew silent near crowded ports. The air that once smelled of fuel slowly changed, and in that change, a new hunger began to spread across the powerful nations of the world. This hunger was not for black liquid buried beneath sand. It was for invisible wealth, rare earth minerals, lithium, cobalt, manganese, gold, not for jewelry, but for circuit boards and satellites. A kind of wealth that did not shine in the sun, but glowed quietly inside batteries, screens, medical machines, and defense systems. Africa, long treated as a background for other people's ambitions, found itself again at the center of global attention. But something had changed. The memory of extraction without respect was still fresh. The old wounds of colonial contracts, broken promises, and divided communities had never truly healed. This time, African leaders were more careful, more patient, more calculating. They watched the world's new interest with quiet eyes and asked a different kind of question. Not who wanted the resources, but who would walk beside them instead of above them. India stepped into this new age with a story that felt familiar to African ears. A story of land once ruled by outsiders. A story of wealth taken away. A story of struggle for self-definition. It did not arrive with loud military fleets or declarations of dominance. It arrived with memory, strategy, and an understanding that pride is not something that can be bought. Burkina Faso was not the largest country involved in this story. It was not the richest. It did not command the loudest voice in international halls. But it carried something more valuable than size or noise. It carried clarity. Long ignored by global decision-makers, Burkina Faso had learned to survive without applause. Its people knew how to work under harsh sun, how to build community in dry winds, how to keep dignity in the face of scarcity. When the resource conversations began again, the country was ready. The first serious discussions between Burkinabe officials and Indian representatives did not take place in glamorous hotels. They took place in rooms cooled by fans that barely worked, with dust drifting through open windows. There were no hurried handshakes, only long silences, careful listening, and cups of strong tea that went cold before anyone noticed. India's interest moved far beyond oil. Beneath the ancient rocks of Burkina Faso lay lithium deposits unknown to most of the world. Manganese beds stretched across forgotten stretches of land. Gold was present, but it was no longer the main attraction. The future lived in metals that powered silence, screens, and speed. Other powers would have called it a scramble. Burkina Faso called it a negotiation of dignity. Unlike past visitors who arrived with finished contracts and unmoving demands, India brought maps, scientists, and questions. Engineers walked the land, not to claim it, but to understand it. They listened to farmers. They observed water patterns. They studied the damage left behind by previous mining projects from other foreign powers. This approach was slower, but slowness had power. Trust grows in silence more than noise. Around the continent, ears began to turn. Leaders in Mali, Niger, Ghana, and further south watched closely. They were tired of deals that left their countries poorer than before. They were curious about a partnership that did not feel like surrender. Agreements between Burkina Faso and India looked unfamiliar to outsiders. They were filled with clauses about education, training, and skill transfer. They spoke about laboratories, not just mines. They included commitments to build processing facilities inside Africa, instead of shipping raw resources away. The world's traditional powers grew nervous. China had built railways. Western institutions had built debt. But India was building something harder to fight: shared knowledge. That was not an invasion. It was influence of a quieter kind, and that frightened those who had grown comfortable with being needed. Across the Sahel, solar panels rose under open skies, panels that fed grids powering new industrial zones. Indian engineers and Burkinabe technicians stood shoulder to shoulder, not separated by power, but connected by responsibility. The lithium pulled from African soil was not immediately shipped away. It was refined. processed, turned into components inside West African facilities. That single change altered everything. Young Burkinabe students boarded planes not as beggars, but as sponsored scholars. They traveled to Indian universities to study geology, renewable energy, artificial intelligence, robotics, and environmental protection. They sat in classrooms as equals, carrying the weight of their homeland with quiet pride. When they returned, they did not accept minor roles. They built companies. They supervised projects. They trained others. They became proof that Africa did not need to export its intelligence along with its minerals. Pan-Africanism, once treated as a dream of the past, became practical. It was no longer just words spoken from podiums. It was policy. Burkina Faso shared its frameworks with neighboring nations. Joint research centers were built close to borders. Resource management conferences were held in African capitals, not foreign ones. Countries that had once been shaped to compete with each other began to speak of cooperation. India listened. India adapted. It was not a perfect relationship. No country moves without self-interest. India needed stable mineral supplies for its expanding industries. It needed partnerships to strengthen its global position. It needed allies in international negotiations. But it understood a hard-learned truth. Domination creates rebellion, while respect creates loyalty. Burkina Faso understood this truth from survival. Their agreements ensured that a significant share of revenue stayed within African hands. Environmental protections were written into reality, not merely spoken. Sacred lands and culturally important areas were marked as protected zones. These were not symbolic gestures. They were enforced boundaries. Slowly, the phrase "beyond oil" turned from theory into lived experience. Africa stopped being seen as a warehouse of raw materials and started being recognized as a workshop of progress. Processing plants rose under African skies. Training institutes filled with young minds. Roads connected industrial areas designed not only for export, but for internal growth. Global observers still preferred the word "scramble" because conflict was easier to sell than cooperation. But on the ground, the reality was different. Farmers saw schools powered by reliable energy. Miners worked with modern safety standards. Communities that had once lived in darkness studied under lights powered by their own sun. Burkina Faso did not become a puppet. It became a pattern. Other countries began redesigning their contracts. The idea of African-owned resource corridors spread. Instead of being pressured into competition, nations began forming collective resource councils. They set shared standards, shared prices, shared expectations. This shift unsettled many traditional powers. Whispers grew in foreign ministries. Reports were written with worried tones. Meetings were held behind closed doors. The realization began to surface that Africa was no longer waiting to be chosen. Africa was choosing. India's influence deepened, not by force, but by practice. Exchange programs multiplied. Cultural ties strengthened. Trade routes were designed around long-term stability rather than short-term gain. Defense discussions existed, but they were quiet and cautious. No loud parades. No intimidation. Burkina Faso played the role of bridge, not only between India and Africa, but between African nations themselves. It hosted conferences. It mediated disputes. It shared technologies. It became proof that even a country often ignored by global media could reshape continental policy. In small villages, the effects were felt before they were understood. Water purification systems powered by solar energy replaced unreliable sources. Clinics received equipment manufactured from locally processed metals. Roads reached areas once trapped by isolation. Young people stopped dreaming only of escape and started dreaming of construction. The world beyond Africa reacted slowly, then loudly. Articles appeared warning about a new axis forming. Talks of influence, expansion, and strategy dominated global discussions. The old powers framed it as a challenge, a threat, a shift that needed to be managed. But among the African people, it felt like relief. This was not about replacing one master with another. It was about standing upright. It was about shaping agreements instead of receiving orders. It was about erasing the long-held idea that African wealth was meant to leave African hands. India never claimed innocence. It moved with calculation. It knew what it wanted, but it also knew what it could not afford to lose: trust. Burkina Faso protected that trust carefully. When terms seemed unfair, it paused discussions. When environmental risks seemed too high, it adjusted frameworks. When local communities raised concerns, it listened. Time passed. New factories hummed across West Africa. Research centers flourished. Inter-African trade increased. The old dependency on distant approval weakened. The internal strength grew quietly, like roots under fertile soil. The world's map did not change. No borders moved. No flags fell. But power shifted anyway. This was the new scramble. Not for land, not for control, not for humiliation, but for partnership, for position, for the right to say, we were part of building this future. In international halls, speeches grew careful. The words aid and assistance slowly disappeared, replaced with cooperation and mutual growth. These were not just new words. They were forced changes. Burkina Faso remained calm through it all. It did not boast. It did not threaten. It simply worked. Villages once built from survival began to build for the future. Schools taught coding alongside traditional agriculture. Children understood both the soil and the circuit. Identity became something stable again, not something fragile. India's presence was visible, but not overpowering. Joint factories, shared laboratories, technological centers run by local leadership. The relationship did not eliminate tension, but it created balance. Quietly, the world adapted. What had begun as a search for resources had transformed into a shift in philosophy. Power was no longer defined by how much you could take, but by how much you could build without breaking others. The strongest truth was not announced. It was felt. Africa was no longer a silent partner in its own story. Burkina Faso did not need oil to matter. It did not need permission to lead. It did not need fear to command attention. And India had found something more valuable than minerals. It had found respect that could not be mined, exported, or stolen. In the world beyond oil, alliances were measured not by weapons stored, but by futures shared. The wind that crossed the Sahel carried fewer whispers of loss and more echoes of ambition. The sun that burned over the land powered not only machines, but confidence. No headlines could fully capture it. No global report could reduce it. No old power could reverse it. Africa was no longer standing at the door of history. It had stepped inside and begun to write.